Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tech Tips from Coopsys. I am Scott Spatz, the president of Cooperative Systems, and today I'm going to talk to you about what ransomware is and how it works. And then we'll talk about how and what to expect if it does happen to you, which is the most important thing here. We need to talk about before it happens, so you can be prepared, and everything you can do to protect yourself and your business if it does actually happen, and God forbid it does actually happen to your business. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We should quickly address the overarching term malware before diving into the term ransomware. So malware is short for malicious software, and it is the umbrella term for various kinds of software related to tricks that criminals use to get access into your systems and your assets. You have no doubt heard of a number of different forms of malware. There are viruses where some code is attached to a file that gets opened and passed along, kind of along that way. There's spyware, where it finds a home onto your system and then it collects info and sends that back to the hacker. There are worms, which replicate on your system and attach all kinds of files and look for connections between computers and storage areas, and the list goes on. There's so many different terms out there. And the long story short here is that there's a lot of different ways the systems can get affected by malware. Specifically, ransomware is actually a specific subtype of malware because it's a form of a Trojan attack. And Trojans disguise as a legitimate looking software, but once they're executed and they're in, they can do their damage. With ransomware, it takes over and holds things hostage. And the goal is to get the ransom from the victim or victims. There are a few ways that ransomware can get into your machine. It might be via email, where you can see an attachment that looks innocent, so you go ahead and open it. Or it might be some download request notification or pop-up and some software that you click on thinking it's just a standard plugin or update. Or it can come through posing as a free version or an update to an existing game or software or something that you already have on your machine and you at least recognize. This happens a lot with third-party tools and games. It might also take the form of a Java update or patch or to a version of Adobe Flash, for example. And you might recognize all these forms of what's called social engineering. Once it gets into your machine or on your network, there are a couple ways you can make an impact. There are encryptors and there are lockers. Encryptors are sometimes called crypto ransomware because the cyber criminal often asks for the payment in cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. They take your data hostage, the data gets converted into a code using encryption, and that locks it up. It's then held hostage until it gets decrypted, if that ever actually happens. Here's an example of what you might see on your screen. It can be a little scary. You may have heard of this one called CryptoLocker, which was running rampant back in 2013 and 2014 when it was aggressively attacking Microsoft Windows machines. It goes from computer to computer by traveling as an email attachment. And when people open it, it gets in and encrypts files and asks for payment with a promise to give your data back. As we'll discuss in a minute, decryption doesn't always happen, even if you do pay up. The other type of ransomware, lockers, will take over the device or even the whole network connected to it. Rather than taking specific data and holding that hostage, lockers will literally lock things down and not let anybody use the device or the devices. It can even prevent computers from starting up if they're on the network that's infected. This example here shows what you might see. As you can see in the example, the criminals will often attempt to make the recipients feel vulnerable by incorporating sensitive topics. Plus, they can disguise themselves as an authority source to threaten you even more. For this one, it's giving specific instructions on how to pay, and it's quite a process. And believe it or not, people will go through great lengths to fulfill requests with the hope that it'll clear things up. But unfortunately, it rarely ever happens and ever ends with the payment, as I mentioned earlier. So both of these types might at times have a time limit associated with them that's set by the hacker. If you don't pay, the hacker supposedly sabotages the data or the software after that time's up. So if this happens to you or someone in your company, should you just follow through with instructions, pay the ransom, and hope for the best case scenario? No, that's certainly the last thing you should try to do and find your way out of the situation. Don't double down and reward the criminals knowing that there is zero guarantee that you'll get your files or systems back. The odds of recovery are typically extremely low, and if you go about it that way. And not only that, but paying out in an attempt to revive whatever you've lost, you're actually fueling those attackers to keep up that cycle of attacks. So if you're not going to pay it, what should you do if you do encounter ransomware? So first and foremost, isolate it. Disconnect your machine from any networks and go offline. Try to separate your infection from the rest of the network that you're on. Don't unplug the power or try to erase anything using scanning tools. Just get yourself to a point where you've isolated your system and yourself. Next, you should capture it. Use your cell phone or camera to take a picture of the warning screen. If you have an IT person or team, stop right there and go straight to them and report it. They'll help you navigate from there. This is also a good thing to do if you file a police report. Task forces on both the local and federal level are always grateful for these because they help them in attempts to recognize and stop these crimes. If you don't have an IT help desk to take it from there, here are a couple ways you can approach things, which brings us to the next step, actually, which is identify. Identify what you're dealing with and the resources available to address it. Try and determine the strain of ransomware so you can do some research. In this process, determine any resources you might be connected to figure out the scope of the problem. This will also help you figure out later where you may need to recover files and where you have backups. Are any USB drives plugged in that have files you need? Are you connected to any cloud services like Dropbox or OneDrive, or any shared network drives on your corporate or business network? At this stage, you might also research decryptor services, but be very careful because many of these at times are just more tricks coming from cyber criminals who know you're vulnerable. Now you can start to take action. You really only have a couple of options though here. Your best option is to restore from backups. So with all the resources available out there to back up your systems nowadays, it's so important to leverage those so that if you fall victim to this sort of thing, you can go back to your backups and fall back on your backups. It takes some of the heat off of these situations knowing that you've got an actionable plan and there is recoverable version of whatever is being held hostage. Ahead of a threat, you should make sure you've determined what your needs are as far as recovery points and timelines. Figure out how long it might take to get things back to where they were before the ransom struck and decide whether your backup resources can meet your needs. This will help construct your recovery plan. And once you have those backups in place, make sure you regularly test your disaster recovery plan using those backups. Hopefully you'll be able to restore things if something like this happens, but unfortunately for too many businesses out there, it's not always the case, and that's where it can get ugly. All right, so what if you don't have backups in place to restore things? The other option is basically to take the hit by letting go of what's being held hostage. From there, you'll just have to refresh your systems to a working state. This means you'd wipe the slate clean, and you'd only do this if you knew things aren't looking good and you don't have backups and you're being forced to cut bait. You would need to do a full reinstall of your operating system. That's a key thing. You don't just lose data. You're going to lose all your settings and links to cloud resources and connected resources. So you're going to have to reestablish and reset up all those items. It's a viable solution if you absolutely need to get things back up and you're able to cut your losses. Our ransomware hostage rescue manual will walk you through some of the steps on how to handle this situation when you're stuck, including how to go about paying the criminal if you choose to take that route. It can be pretty complex if there's cryptocurrency or currency exchanges involved, and again, there are no guarantees, sadly. At the bottom of this slide is a link URL for that guide, and we'll have that URL also mentioned on our last slide for reference. So based on all of what we've talked about here, you may have guessed, but the absolute #1 best way to prevent the occurrence of ransomware and other malware is to educate users on how to identify it and prevent it. Prevent this social engineering. An effective security awareness program can really keep your company and your users completely out of the hands of ransomware. Things like a firewall, anti-spam, and anti-malware programs and policies for restricting software downloads and third-party apps and other technical safeguards can also play a huge part. But really, it's the us as humans we are the first line of defense here that can make or break the situation. Technical tools can't always stop that ransomware if one of your employees opens the door and lets it into your systems. Hopefully this Tech Tips episode has given you some useful tactics for fighting the waves of ransomware out there. And certainly don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you have any other questions or if you're interested in learning about our security awareness training program for your employees. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode of Tech Tips from Coopsys.